The city chewed up dreamers like Nova Sinclair and spat them out into places like this, crumbling corners where hope felt like a bad joke. She'd arrived in the Hollows, a forgotten wedge of the city where buildings sagged like tired old men, their bricks stained with decades of rain and neglect. Her new apartment, a third-floor walk-up with a rusted fire escape, smelled of damp concrete and something sour, like the ghost of someone else's bad decisions. The walls were peeling, yellowed paint curling back to reveal gray plaster underneath, and the single flickering bulb in the hallway buzzed like a dying insect. She stood in the doorway, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and felt the weight of her brother's absence settle into her bones. Hi family, I need you to help subscribe to this channel to help us grow, and to help us give you more interesting stories. Thank you. Now let's continue. Nova wasn't broken. Not yet. But grief had a way of making her movements deliberate, as if rushing might crack the thin shell holding her together. She set her bag on the warped wooden floor and crossed to the window, where a cracked photo frame found its place on the sill. It held a picture of her and Caleb, his grin wide and reckless, taken 2 summers ago when the world still made sense. She didn't look at it long. Instead, she turned to unpack, folding his old flannel shirt with care, her fingers lingering on the frayed collar as if it might still carry his warmth. The city outside hummed with suspicion, car horns blaring, voices shouting in the distance, the low growl of a motorcycle cutting through the dusk. It was alive, this place, but not in a comforting way. It watched her through the streaked glass, its streets narrow and shadowed, daring her to stay. The elevator down the hall groaned, its doors never quite closing, clattering like a warning every few minutes. Nova locked her door, checking the bolt twice, a habit she'd picked up since Caleb's death. The police had called it an accident, wrong place, wrong time, but the explanation felt hollow, like a story told to keep questions at bay. She didn't ask anymore. She just moved, one foot in front of the other, carrying what was left of her life to this decaying corner of the world. The name Grayson Vale slipped into her awareness like a cold draft. She first heard it from the landlord, a wiry man with darting eyes who'd handed her the keys with a warning to keep to herself. His voice had dropped when he mentioned the tenant downstairs, as if saying the name too loudly might summon something dangerous. Grayson Vale don't like visitors, he'd muttered, then shuffled off, leaving Nova to wonder why the air felt heavier after he spoke. Later, she saw the name again, scratched into the dented mailbox in the lobby, sharp, jagged letters, like someone had carved them in anger. She didn't know who he was, but the city seemed to. The streets whispered it in the way they fell quiet when certain shadows passed, in the way the bodega clerk across the road glanced nervously at the alley. Grayson Vale was a presence, a specter woven into the hollow's decay, and Nova felt his existence like a pulse just out of reach. She spent her first evening unpacking what little she'd brought: books, a chipped mug, a blanket that still smelled faintly of her old life. The apartment was small, the kind of place where every creak and drip felt personal. The radiator hissed, spitting heat that did little to chase away the chill. Outside, the city never slept, its sounds bleeding through the thin walls. A dog barking, a bottle shattering, the low murmur of voices that never seemed to laugh. Nova sat on the sagging mattress, her hands resting on her knees, and listened to the hollows breathe. It was judging her, she thought, testing whether she'd run or stay. As night deepened, the sounds shifted. The elevator's groan grew infrequent, the street quieter, as if the city held its breath. Nova stood to double-check the lock, her shadow stretching long across the floor. That's when she heard it. A faint knock, barely audible, like a question asked in a whisper. She froze, her hand hovering over the bolt. The sound didn't come again, but the silence that followed was heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. She stepped back, her pulse quickening, and glanced at the door. A slip of paper lay on the floor, half pushed under the gap. It hadn't been there before. She didn't move to pick it up, not yet. Outside, the slow, deliberate tread of boots paused just beyond her door, then faded into the night. The hollows were awake, and something dark had just begun. The morning after the knock, Nova woke to a city holding its breath. The hollows were too quiet, the usual clamor of car horns and shouting voices dulled to a low hum, as if the streets themselves were waiting for something to break. Her apartment felt smaller in the gray light filtering through the cracked window, the air heavy with the damp, sour smell that clung to everything. She knelt by the door, her fingers brushing the floor where the slip of paper had been last night. It was gone now, swept away or imagined, but the memory of those boots pausing outside her door lingered like a bruise. She stood, checked the lock again, and told herself it was nothing. The city was full of ghosts, and she wasn't here to chase them. Nova had taken a part-time job at a repair shop 2 blocks over, a cluttered hole in the wall called Marty's Fixes, where the counter was stained with grease and the air smelled of motor oil and burnt coffee. She spent her first shift sorting tools and tallying receipts, her hands moving with the same deliberate care she'd used to fold Caleb's shirt the night before. The work kept her mind steady, but the tension from the night clung to her, a faint pulse of unease she couldn't shake. Every creak of the shop's loose floorboards made her glance toward the door, half expecting to see a shadow that didn't belong. It was late afternoon when the air shifted. The shop's usual hum, clinking wrenches, Marty's muttering, faltered, like a song skipping a beat. Nova looked up from the counter, where she'd been wiping down a rusted socket wrench, and saw him. He stood just inside the doorway, his frame filling the space without trying. Not tall, not broad, but solid in a way that made the room feel smaller. His dark jacket was worn at the elbows, his hands tucked into his pockets, and his silence was louder than any voice in the hollows. The shop owner, Marty, stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting to the man before settling on the floor. A customer at the counter grabbed his keys and left without a word, the bell above the door jangling too loudly in the quiet. Nova didn't know his name, not yet, but she felt the weight of him. Grayson Vale. The city had whispered it to her in warnings, in the jagged letters on the mailbox, and now here he was, standing like he owned the shadows. He didn't speak, just stepped to the counter and set down a carburetor, the metal clinking softly against the wood. His hands were steady, knuckle-scarred, moving with a precision that made her think of someone who fixed things not because he had to, but because he knew how to bend the world to his will. She rang him up, her fingers brushing the coins he slid across the counter, cool and worn, like they'd been carried too long. His eyes caught hers for half a heartbeat, gray, unreadable, sharp enough to cut through the haze of her thoughts. She looked away first, her breath catching in her chest, a mix of curiosity and something heavier, like the instinct to step back from a ledge. "Need anything else?" she asked, her voice steady despite the way her pulse ticked faster. He shook his head, just once, and turned to leave, his boots scuffing softly against the floor. Marty exhaled when the door closed, muttering something about that one under his breath, but Nova didn't ask. She didn't need to. The city had already told her enough. She kept working, but her thoughts drifted, snagging on the way he'd moved, calm, deliberate, like a man who knew the weight of every step. She told herself to let it go. Men like that were trouble, the kind that left marks you didn't see until it was too late. Yet she wondered, in the quiet spaces between her tasks, what kind of man could make a room hold its breath without saying a word. As she locked up the shop that evening, the street outside was dim, the streetlights flickering like they were as tired as the city itself. On the counter, forgotten or left on purpose, was a small silver lighter, its surface scratched but warm, as if it still held the heat of his hand. Nova slipped it into her pocket, her fingers curling around it, and felt the tilt of her world shift just a fraction. Something had started, something she couldn't name, and the hollows were watching, waiting for the next move. The lighter sat heavy in Nova's pocket as she locked up Marty's Fixes, its scratched surface pressing against her hip like a reminder she couldn't shake. The street outside was a bruise of shadows, the air thick with the smell of oil and cigarette smoke that clung to the hollows like a second skin. She pulled her jacket tighter, her steps quick against the cracked pavement. But the city felt wrong tonight, too still, like it was holding its breath again. The hum of a car engine lingered somewhere behind her, low and steady, following just long enough to make her shoulders tense. She glanced back, saw nothing but the flicker of a streetlight, and told herself it was just the hollows playing tricks. But her pulse didn't believe her. All day, she tried to bury the memory of him, the man who'd stood in the shop, silent as a storm waiting to break. His gray eyes had lingered in her mind, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the monotony of sorting tools and wiping down counters. She'd caught herself pausing mid-task, her fingers tracing the edge of the lighter without meaning to, wondering why a stranger's presence could feel like a weight she both carried and craved. It was foolish, she knew. Men like him were the kind you crossed the street to avoid. But the hollows didn't care about reason. It was a place that thrived on instinct, and hers was whispering to look twice. She was halfway down the alley shortcut to her apartment when the footsteps started, soft, deliberate, matching her pace. Not loud enough to be careless, but not quiet enough to hide. Her breath hitched, and she quickened her steps, the lighter in her pocket suddenly feeling like a lifeline. The alley opened to a street corner, and that's when she saw him. Grayson Vale stepped out from the shadow of a shuttered storefront, his silhouette cutting through the dim glow of a neon sign. He wasn't rushing, wasn't chasing, just standing there, hands in his jacket pockets, like he'd been waiting all along. The air shifted, heavier now, charged with the kind of silence that made her skin prickle. "You're being watched," he said, his voice low, steady, like he was stating a fact as simple as the weather. "Not by me." Nova froze, her defiance flaring even as her heart thudded. "I can handle myself," she said, her words sharper than she felt. She wanted to step back, to put distance between her and the man who made the city hold its breath. But her feet stayed rooted, betraying her. His eyes met hers, unreadable, like a lake frozen over. "Maybe, but someone's been testing boundaries. They don't touch what's mine." The words weren't a threat, but they carried a warning, heavy as the lighter in her pocket. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to make the space between them feel alive. "You're new here. That makes you a target." Her jaw tightened, anger mixing with something else. Something that made her notice the faint scar above his brow, the way his hands stayed still, controlled, like he'd learned to leash something wild. "I don't need your protection," she said, but her voice faltered, caught in the strange pull of his calm. He was cold, calculating, yet there was a flicker in his gaze, a loneliness that echoed the hollow ache she carried for Caleb. Grayson didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the same silver lighter she'd been carrying, and held it out. "You dropped this," he said, though they both knew she hadn't. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, the contact brief but electric, sending a jolt through her that was equal parts fear and something she didn't want to name. He turned to leave, his boots scuffing softly against the pavement, but paused just long enough to glance back. "Stay seen, Nova. It's safer that way." Her name in his mouth felt like a claim, soft but unyielding, and it lingered in the air long after he disappeared into the dark. She stood there, the lighter warm in her palm, her pulse a quiet drumbeat against the city's silence. The hollows watched, and she knew this wasn't the last time Grayson Vale would step into her world. Something had shifted, a line crossed between protection and possession, and it stung softly, like a promise she wasn't ready to keep. The lighter in Nova's pocket felt like a pulse, a quiet reminder of the man who'd left it behind. She carried it through the next day, its weight grounding her as she moved through the motions of routine, locking up Marty's fixes, sweeping the grease-stained floor, counting change under the hum of fluorescent lights. The hollows outside were restless, the air thick with the scent of oil and ash, the streets too quiet, like they were waiting for something to snap. She tried to focus on the ordinary. Keys in hand, jacket zipped, but the memory of his eyes, gray and unyielding, clung to her like damp clothes. She told herself it was nothing, just a stranger's glance. But the city didn't let her believe it. Walking home, the narrow street felt tighter than usual, the shadows longer. Footsteps echoed behind her, faint but deliberate, pacing her own. She quickened her steps, her breath sharp in her chest, and glanced over her shoulder. Nothing but the flicker of a streetlight and the low hum of a car engine idling too long at the corner. Her fingers grazed the lighter in her pocket, and she cursed herself for the way her heart raced. Not just from fear, but from the nagging pull of curiosity she couldn't shake. The hollows were watching, and she felt it in the way the air pressed against her skin, heavy with secrets. She turned into the alley by her building, the one that always smelled of rust and stale beer, when he appeared. Grayson Vale stepped out from the shadow of a crumbling brick wall, his presence as sudden and inevitable as a storm cloud breaking. He didn't move toward her, just stood there, hands in his pockets, his dark jacket blending into the dusk. The city seemed to quiet around him, the distant hum of traffic fading, as if it knew better than to interrupt. His face was unreadable, all sharp angles and stillness, but his eyes held hers with a weight that made her pulse stutter. "You're being followed," he said, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. "Not by me." Nova's instinct was to snap back, to tell him she didn't need his warnings, but her throat tightened. "I can take care of myself," she said, the words firm but thin, betraying the way her hands clenched at her sides. He tilted his head, just slightly studying her. "Maybe, but someone's been crossing lines. They don't touch what's mine." The words weren't loud, weren't threatening, but they carried a cold certainty that made the alley feel smaller. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to make the air between them hum. "You're new. That makes you a mark." Her defiance flared, hot and sharp, but it tangled with something else. A flicker of recognition in his stillness, a loneliness that mirrored the ache she carried for Caleb. She wanted to walk away, to prove she didn't need him, but her feet stayed planted, caught in the contradiction of fear and fascination. His presence was a blade, precise and controlled, and yet she saw the faint weariness in the lines around his eyes, the kind of weight that came from carrying too much for too long. "I don't want your help," she said, her voice quieter now, but it trembled with the effort to mean it. He didn't answer, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. Identical to the one she carried, or maybe the same one, she couldn't tell. He held it out, his fingers steady, and when she took it, their hands brushed, a fleeting spark that made her breath catch. "Stay seen," he said, his voice softer now, but no less heavy. "It's safer." He turned, his boots scraping softly against the pavement, and vanished into the dark as easily as he'd appeared. Nova stood frozen, the lighter warm in her hand, its edges pressing into her palm like a promise she didn't ask for. The hollows exhaled around her, the night alive with whispers, and she knew this wasn't the end. Something had taken root, a dangerous thread weaving between safety and possession, and it stung softly, like a wound she wasn't ready to name. The lighter burned a hole in Nova's pocket, its weight a quiet accusation as she stood in her apartment, the echo of Grayson's warning, "Stay seen," still curling through her thoughts like smoke. The room felt different now, smaller, as if the cracked walls and peeling paint were closing in, whispering secrets they'd held too long. The hollows outside were restless, rain starting to tap against the window, each drop sharp and deliberate, like the city itself was trying to speak. She moved to the sink, splashing water on her face, but the chill couldn't wash away the feeling that every shadow, every creak, carried his name now. Grayson Vale, the man who'd stepped out of the dark and made her feel both safer and more exposed than ever before. She tried to hold on to routine, to anchor herself in the mundane. Boiling water for coffee, folding Caleb's old flannel shirt, but the world outside her door refused to stay quiet. At the corner shop, she caught his name again, hissed in a low argument between two men who stopped talking when she passed. On her walk home, a black SUV rolled by, its engine a low growl, and the street went silent, men turning their faces away as if it carried a plague. A mural on a brick wall near her building stopped her cold. A faded image of a boy, his eyes half covered by graffiti that read, "Vale owns the street." The paint was old, chipped, but the words felt alive, watching her as she stood there, her breath fogging in the damp air. Nova's thoughts churned, caught between denial and a nagging need to know. She didn't want to see the connections forming, but they were there, sharp as broken glass. In a drawer, buried under receipts and loose keys, she found a photo she hadn't seen in years. Caleb, grinning, his arms slung around a man whose face was half-turned, but whose sharp jaw and shadowed eyes felt hauntingly familiar. Grayson. The realization settled like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. Her brother's death, called an accident, a wrong place, wrong time tragedy, suddenly felt like a lie she'd been too tired to question. She wanted to shove the photo back, to unsee it, but her hands trembled, and the truth wouldn't let go. That evening, driven by something she couldn't name, she followed a man she'd seen lingering near the shop, a wiry figure in a leather jacket, his eyes darting like he was carrying someone else's orders. He led her to a warehouse at the edge of the hollows, its windows boarded, the air thick with wet asphalt and rust. Through a crack in the door, she heard voices, low and clipped, one mentioning Caleb's mess and Vale's rules. Her breath caught, the words slicing through her, slow and deliberate, like a knife turning in her gut. She backed away, her boots soft against the gravel. But the city seemed to know, the rain falling harder now, soaking her jacket as if to mark her. Grayson found her later, stepping into the dim light of her building's stairwell as she climbed to her apartment. His shadow filled the space before she saw him, his presence a quiet weight that made the air hum. "You're digging," he said, his voice low, not accusing but certain. "You won't like what you find." Her anger flared, hot and raw, but it tangled with the pull of his gaze, the way he stood so still, like a man who'd learned to carry guilt without breaking. "Was it you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb?" He didn't answer, but his silence was louder than words, heavy with truths he wouldn't speak. The space between them crackled, her fear and fury blurring into something that made her want to step closer, even as every instinct screamed to run. He left without another word, but the air held his presence, like the storm outside refusing to fade. Back in her apartment, Nova sat on the floor, the photo of Caleb and Grayson beside her, the lighter cold in her hand. She didn't cry. She didn't move. The truth had walked into the room, and nothing would ever be the same. The truth about Caleb's death sat in Nova's chest like a splinter, sharp and unyielding, as she stood in her apartment, the photo of him and Grayson still on the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rain's relentless drum against the window, a rhythm that felt like the hollows counting down to something inevitable. The city outside had turned restless, whispers snaking through the streets, eyes tracking her from shadowed corners, the low rumble of a car circling her building too many times to be chance. She didn't run. Not this time. She stayed, her hand steady as she locked the door, though the bolt felt flimsier than ever. The lighter Grayson had given her sat on the windowsill now, catching the faint glow of a streetlight, its scratches glinting like a warning she couldn't ignore. The hollows were no longer just watching, they were closing in. She felt it in the way the bodega clerk avoided her eyes, in the graffiti that appeared overnight on her building's wall. A single word, Vale, scrawled in red. Nova moved through her days with a new vigilance, her steps measured, her senses sharp. But the world was unraveling, and she was caught in its threads. Late that night, the air turned sour with the smell of wet asphalt and something sharper. Gasoline, maybe, or fear. A crash shattered the quiet, her apartment door splintering as someone forced their way in. No shouts, no threats, just the heavy tread of boots and the glint of a blade in the dark. Her pulse roared, but before she could move, a shadow cut through the room. Grayson, his presence a sudden, silent force. The intruder froze, then fled, the sound of his boots fading into the stairwell's echo. Grayson didn't chase him. He stood there, breathing hard, a smear of blood on his sleeve that wasn't his. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low, not asking. Nova's instinct was to argue, to dig in her heels, but the adrenaline in her veins and the splintered door behind her silenced any protest. She followed, her jacket barely zipped, the lighter clutched in her fist as he led her through the rain-slicked streets to a safe house at the edge of the hollows. A shuttered warehouse, its air thick with dust and the faint tang of gasoline. The space was bare, all cracked concrete and rusted beams, but it felt like them. Broken, stubborn, still standing. Inside, Grayson checked the locks twice. His movements precise but frayed at the edges, like a man holding himself together with fraying thread. Nova sat on a crate, her knees pulled up, watching him in the dim light of a single bulb. She didn't ask about the blood, and he didn't explain. The silence between them was heavy, not empty, filled with the weight of what they weren't saying. She noticed the way his hands flexed, as if fighting the urge to reach for something, her maybe, or the control he was losing. Her own walls were crumbling, fear giving way to a fascination that felt like stepping into a current she couldn't fight. He wasn't just the man everyone feared anymore. He was the one who'd stood between her and a blade, and that truth shifted something deep inside her. Hours passed, the rain outside softening to a murmur. Nova's eyes grew heavy, and she let herself lean against the wall, the lighter still in her hand. When she woke, the warehouse was quiet, the bulb dimmer. Grayson sat across from her, his back to the wall, his gaze fixed on the floor. His knuckles were bruised, his jaw tight, but there was a softness in the way he looked at her now, like he was seeing her for the first time. She didn't move, didn't speak, just held the lighter tighter, its warmth a tether between them. The chaos had settled, but the stillness that followed was fragile, a moment suspended between what was and what would come. Nova wasn't an outsider anymore. She was part of his world now, woven into its shadows, and the thread between them had tightened into something that felt like fate. The confession hung in the air like ash after a fire, settling into the cracks of the safe house where Nova and Grayson had laid their truths bare. Dawn broke, gray and unforgiving, and the warehouse felt tighter, its concrete walls pressing in as if the truth had shrunk the world. Nova was gone by the time Grayson stirred, her absence a blade slipped between his ribs. The crate where she'd slept was empty, the blanket folded too neatly, a single photograph, her and Caleb, edges worn, missing from the floor. Her half-packed bag sat abandoned, zipper caught on a torn seam, like she'd left in a hurry but with purpose. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was a verdict. Nova hadn't run out of fear. She'd left because staying meant surrendering something she wasn't ready to give. She moved through the hollows at first light, her boots scuffing against streets slick with last night's rain, the taste of stale coffee bitter on her tongue. The city felt different now, its pulse uneven, like a heart skipping beats. Rumors had spread faster than she'd expected. Whispers in the bodega, eyes narrowing at the sight of her. Caleb's name floated in hushed corners, tied to Grayson's, tied to deals gone wrong. She'd heard it at a diner, two men muttering about a debt unpaid, their voices dropping when she lingered too long. Her choice to vanish was survival, not surrender, a quiet act of defiance against a world that wanted to claim her. Grayson felt her absence like a weight he couldn't shift. He stood in the safe house, staring at the empty crate, his hand trembling as he gripped the lighter she'd left behind, its metal warm from his pocket. Control, his oldest armor, was cracking. He missed a meet with his crew, left a shipment untouched at the docks, the kind of lapse that invited wolves. One of his men, a wiry kid named Rico, pushed back too hard, mouthing off about loyalty in a backroom deal gone sour. Grayson's fist met a wall instead of Rico's face, the plaster giving way, his knuckles raw and stinging. The crew noticed, their glances sharper now, testing boundaries they'd never dared before. The hollows were turning, opportunistic, sensing blood in the water. The neighborhood carried the fallout like a fever. A creditor's black SUV lingered outside the warehouse, its engine idling too long, a message without words. At the corner shop, the clerk spoke of cops circling closer, drawn by whispers of Caleb's death and Grayson's name. A mural near Nova's building had been defaced, veil scratched out in jagged white paint, a rival's mark creeping into its place. The world Grayson had held together with silence and force was fraying, and he couldn't fix it with fists this time. The confession had cost him leverage, left him exposed, and Nova's absence was a wound he hadn't seen coming. She watched from a distance, hidden in the shadow of a boarded-up laundromat, as Rico took a beating in an alley. Two men, faces unfamiliar, moved with the precision of hired muscle, their fists quick and merciless. Nova's instinct was to step in, to call out, but she stayed still, her breath shallow, the lighter in her pocket a cold anchor. She wasn't Grayson's to save, not anymore, but the choice to stay hidden felt heavier than running. Her agency was her own now, carved out in the quiet decision to walk away, but it came with a cost, a loneliness that tasted like dust on her tongue. Grayson stood in the safe house at dusk, a list of names in his hand, men he'd trusted, men he'd buried. He lit a match, watched the paper curl and blacken, but paused when he saw her name wasn't there. The lighter sat heavy in his pocket, a tether to a woman who'd slipped through his fingers. Nova, miles away, stepped onto a bus as dawn broke, the photograph of Caleb tucked into her sleeve, the city blurring past like a life she was leaving behind. The world had shifted, and the next move would cost blood or mercy. She wasn't sure which, but she felt it coming. Time had carved its mark in the quiet way the hollows exhaled, the morning light now thinner, colder, as if the city itself had aged in Nova's absence. Grayson felt it in the dust settling on the safe house table, in the way his own reflection stared back from a cracked mirror, lines deeper around his eyes, like the world had taken a piece he hadn't noticed was gone. The city still bent to his name. Men stepped aside, debts were paid, but his hands hesitated now, lingering too long on the lighter he kept in his pocket. Her lighter, its scratches a map of nights he couldn't forget. The hollows whispered her name in corners he passed, a sound that caught him off guard, like a song he'd sworn he'd unlearned. Nova hadn't meant to come back. She'd carved out a life in the margins, a small room in a neighboring town where the air didn't carry the weight of Caleb's ghost or Grayson's shadow. But survival wasn't enough. Not when the truth still burned. Not when the photograph in her sleeve felt heavier than the miles she'd put between them. She returned to the hollows on a gray afternoon, her steps deliberate, not toward him but to a backstreet diner where the coffee was bitter and the windows streaked with rain. She sat in a booth, her jacket damp, her fingers tracing the edge of a chipped mug, knowing he'd find her. The city always carried news to him, like a tide pulling toward the shore. He appeared in the doorway, not storming but inevitable, his frame cutting through the diner's haze of grease and cigarette smoke. The room didn't quiet this time. Life went on, forks clinking, a waitress muttering, but the air between them tightened, a thread stretched to breaking. He stood across from her, not sitting, his hands still, his jaw a line of restraint. Her eyes traced him, not the man who'd saved her but the one who'd confessed, the one whose truth had sent her running. His coat was worn thinner now, his knuckles scarred from fights she hadn't seen, and something in his gaze looked older, not defeated but frayed, like a rope holding too much weight. She didn't rise, didn't flinch, but her shoulders squared, her strength a quiet match for his presence. She was no longer the woman who'd fled. She'd built something in the distance, a resolve that didn't bend. He watched her, his eyes moving over her face like he was memorizing it again, measuring the space between what he'd lost and what stood before him. Their silence was a language, heavy with regret and something sharper. Temptation, maybe, or the pull of unfinished things. His hand twitched, stopping short of reaching for her, as if the air itself might burn. She noticed, her breath catching, but she didn't move, her fingers still on the mug, grounding her against the ache that hadn't left. The diner's hum faded, the world narrowing to the space between them. Outside, the hollows churned, rumors of Grayson's faltering grip, a rival circling, a cop asking questions about Caleb's death. But here it was just them, two people caught in the gravity of what they'd become. She stood, finally, her chair scraping softly, and stepped toward the door, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. He followed, not close but near enough, his shadow trailing hers like a promise neither could name. She paused at the threshold, rain smearing the street beyond, her hand hovering over the handle. He stopped behind her, close enough that she felt the heat of him, but he didn't speak, didn't touch. The moment hung there, fragile, on the edge of forgiveness or ruin, neither certain. She stepped into the rain, and he let her, but his eyes stayed on her, unblinking, as the city swallowed her silhouette. The air held its breath, waiting for what came next. The rain didn't stop, seeping through the cracked ceiling of the safe house, pooling in corners where shadows clung like grief. Nova stood in the doorway, the echo of their almost reunion a bruise under her skin, her silhouette framed by a city that had already begun to unravel. Grayson was steps away, his back to her, his hands braced against a rusted table as if holding up the world. But the world was slipping, and the silence between them wasn't hope. It was the sound of something breaking before it fell. The hollows had turned feral. Grayson's name, once a blade that cut through the streets, now drew blood in return. His crew fractured. Rico, the wiry kid who'd mouthed off, hadn't shown in days, his absence a crack in the foundation. A creditor's men lingered closer, their cars no longer idling but parked, bold and unapologetic. A fire had gutted a warehouse on the edge of the hollows, one of Grayson's, the air still thick with the smell of charred wood and gasoline. The city whispered betrayal, and Nova felt it in the way eyes followed her. No longer cautious but hungry, waiting for the king to fall. She loved him. The truth of it burned. Not like fire but like frost, sharp and unrelenting. She'd returned to face him, to confront the truth of Caleb's death. But standing in his shadow now, she saw the cost of loving a man who carried ruin like a second skin. Her strength had grown in the miles she'd walked away, but it left her isolated, a woman caught between wanting him and needing to survive. She stood straighter now, her jaw tight, her eyes tracing the way his shoulders sagged, not defeated but worn, like a building one storm away from collapse. The lighter she'd carried was gone, left behind in the diner, and its absence felt like losing a piece of herself. The ruin came quietly at first. A door slammed somewhere in the night, footsteps echoing in the empty hallway outside. Then it turned sharp, a scream cut short, the crack of bone against concrete. One of Grayson's men, loyal until he wasn't, had sold him out. Nova saw it from the window, the flicker of a blade, the slump of a body in the alley below. Grayson moved, not with the precision she'd once known but with a raw, desperate force, his fists meeting flesh until the traitor stopped moving. She watched, her breath shallow, her hands pressed against the cold glass. He was what she'd feared, a man who broke things to keep them, and yet her eyes couldn't leave him, caught in the terrible beauty of his collapse. The safe house felt like a tomb now, its walls stained with rain and memory. Grayson stood in the center, his hands bloodied, his gaze distant, as if seeing a city that no longer answered to him. Nova stepped closer, not out of comfort but necessity, her boots crunching on glass from a broken bulb. Their eyes met through the haze, not soft but heavy, like two people staring across a chasm they'd built together. She wanted to touch him, to feel the pulse under his skin, but her hands stayed still, knowing love couldn't rebuild what was gone. It only carved the wound deeper. When the fire came, it was no surprise. A spark from the alley, a can of gasoline left too close. Flames licked the walls, smoke curling like a lover's promise. They ran, not together but parallel, out into the rain-soaked street where the hollows watched, unblinking. Nova stopped, her chest heaving, her eyes on Grayson as he stood in the downpour, the fire's glow painting him in shades of loss. They were apart again, separated by ash and choice, and the silence between them was all that remained. It settled, heavy and inevitable, beautiful in its ruin. The rain had stopped, leaving the hollows slick and silent, the streets reflecting a dawn that felt too soft for a city so scarred. Nova stood at the edge of her old apartment building, its cracked bricks glowing faintly in the early light, the air sharp with the scent of wet stone and fading ash. The ruin was over, but its echo lingered, a quiet that wasn't peace but something closer to surrender. She breathed differently now, slower, as if her lungs had learned to carry grief without breaking. The city felt emptier, its pulse weaker, like it had lost something vital when Grayson's shadow stopped falling across its streets. He was alive but not the same. Grayson moved through the hollows like a ghost, his empire reduced to whispers and debts no one dared collect. She'd seen him once, days ago, in the haze of a backstreet market, his coat thinner, his eyes carrying a weight that wasn't power anymore but memory. He hadn't approached her, hadn't spoken, just watched her from across the crowd, his hand in his pocket where the lighter used to be. She'd felt it then, the ache of what they'd been, what they'd broken. Not love in the way stories promised, but something rawer, a wound they'd both chosen to keep. Nova hadn't left the city. She'd thought about it, standing at the train station one morning, ticket in hand, the platform cold under her boots. But the hollows had claimed her, its streets woven into her bones. She rebuilt instead, quietly, in the small repair shop where she now worked alone, her hands steady as she fixed things others had given up on. The photograph of Caleb sat on a shelf, not hidden but not stared at, a reminder she could carry without bleeding. She'd learned to live with the truth of his death, with Grayson's role in it, with the love that had burned through her like a fever and left her changed. Their final meeting came without warning, in a place that felt like it belonged to neither of them. A narrow bridge at the city's edge, where the river ran slow and gray under a sky bruised with clouds. She was crossing it, her steps even, when she saw him standing at the far end, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He didn't move closer, and she didn't stop, but their eyes met, holding everything they'd never say. His face was older now, not in years but in the way loss carves itself into skin. Her hands stayed in her pockets, her posture steady, not the girl who'd run or the woman who'd returned, but someone new, someone who'd survived. They stood there, the river murmuring below, the wind carrying the faint smell of salt and rust. No words, no promises, just the weight of what had been. A confession, a fire, a love that hadn't saved them but had reshaped them instead. She turned first, her boots soft against the bridge, and he let her go, his shadow unmoving as the city swallowed her once more. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acceptance, a quiet settling of accounts. Nova walked back to her apartment, the streets empty now, the hollows no longer watching. She lit a candle, its flame small but steady, and sat in the dark, her fingers tracing the edge of a toolbox, the only thing she'd kept from the safe house. The world had ended, not with fire or blood, but with the soft click of a door closing behind her.